Hi, and welcome to this episode of King's Conversations. Today we're talking about the skin shade prejudice known as colorism. I'm joined today by Dr. Aisha Phoenix, a lecturer here in social justice at King's College. Today we're going to talk about what colorism is, why it matters, and how we're going to tackle it here in the UK. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure.
So first off, can you just kind of explain what colorism is and how it differs from racism?
Definitely. What's really interesting is that lots of people don't actually know what colorism is, even though they might have been subjected to it. So because it's got different terms, some people call it colorism, some people call it shadism, pigmentocracy, and it all refers to skin shade prejudice, in which people with dark skin are subjected to more prejudice than those with lighter skin shades. And it also can include features. For example, if you're someone of African heritage, how broad your nose is, having a broader nose, fuller lips, very curly hair can mean you're subjected to more prejudice than someone with an aquiline nose, thinner lips, and straight hair. So that's how the colorism can manifest itself. And in terms of how it's different from racism, so colorism can be both within a racialized group, someone black can be colorist towards someone else who's black, or between racialized groups. And racism is prejudice against someone of a particular minoritized ethnic group from someone outside of that group.
Okay. And so how does colorism manifest in society?
So colorism is a global issue, so it affects people of color all around the world. And I would imagine that it manifests itself in different ways in those different regions. And even within a certain country, it can be different depending on whereabouts the context has a major impact. So lots of the research on colorism has been conducted in the United States of America, particularly amongst African Americans. And what that research has found is that colorism affects people in education, in the criminal justice system, in relationships and employment, and also in terms of health. So it affects them in many, many important areas of their lives. So if you take education as a starting point, it can affect, so people with dark skin often complete fewer years of schooling, they're less likely to go into higher education, they're likely to get lower grades, teacher expectations are lower for students with dark skin. So it has a really profound impact on people's opportunities. And then in terms of relationships, now colorism is gendered, women and men's experiences are different, although both are subjected to colorism. So women with dark skin are seen as less attractive, they're less likely to get a marriage, they're less likely to be married or to find a partner. And also if they do find a partner, they're likely to be a partner of a lower status. So it has a profound impact on opportunities there as well. And then in terms of the criminal justice system, research has found that people with dark skin are sentenced for longer than those with lighter skin shades from the same racialized backgrounds as well. And then employment equally, it affects your opportunities there too. So it's really important to be mindful of the fact that colorism affects people of all ethnicities, people of color of all ethnicities, because I think often you'll see people blogging about colorism affecting black people or talking about colorism affecting black people, but it's really important to look at the way in which it affects people who are Asian or Arab or Chinese, etc. So that's one thing I'd really want to stress, that it affects people of color of all different ethnicities. And in the skin shade project I did with Nadia Craddock, we also had some participants who were Asian who talked about the experiences that they had and their parents saying, oh, you're not going to find a partner to marry because your skin is too dark, or a parent buying a bleaching cream for their child because they thought their skin was too dark as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like, there might be a misconception that it only affects black people, but it's really any person of color can experience colorism.
Exactly, and it can have a real profound impact on them. We had a Chinese participant who talked about their parent and their sister telling them not to go out in the sun because they've got darker, and getting really annoyed with them because their skin got darker in the sun.
Yeah, no, I had a friend growing up who was from India, and her mom would say the same thing. I'd be trying to get a tan on the beach, and she'd be like, oh, my mom said I can't go in the sun, I can't get any darker. And that didn't really make sense to me at the time. But having this conversation, I understand that was a form of colorism from her own parent that I wasn't even conscious of.
Exactly. And often, as we talked about, colorism is gendered. So women are affected particularly by the idea about them being attractiveness and having light skin. And so you might find that parents are more likely to dissuade their daughters from going in the sun, especially if they think it has an impact on their ability to then find partners later on if their skin's too dark.
Yeah, and that's just so interesting, because to have that come from a parent who's supposed to be a safe space and hopefully protecting them from experiences of racism, to have your parent being the one telling you that and displaying colorism to you, what a way to internalize it.
No, it's really problematic because, as you mentioned, if the family is supposed to be a protective space against the racism that people of color experience in society, and yet they are then subjecting young people to prejudice, it's really, really damaging, and it has an impact on self-esteem, body image, and you can imagine it can have an impact on mental health as well.
Absolutely. And then you internalize it, and then that's how it perpetuates the systemic aspect of it too. How are we tackling this problem? How are we tackling colorism? I know it's a global problem, so you might not be able to speak to that globally, but what about like here in the UK? What's being done to tackle it?
So in terms of in the UK, there are campaigns, there are online campaigns where people are raising awareness about colorism and trying to challenge it in that way. And I've recently been awarded a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship to explore.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. To explore colorism among young people in the UK. So we're doing research at secondary schools, 6 secondary schools in the UK, exploring this issue. And I think what's really important about that is the more data we have, the more we're able to identify what the issues are and then to start challenging them. And one of the things that our project will be doing is designing a lesson for students, PSA, a personal, social, health and economic education lesson for students, maybe a series of lessons that help them to raise awareness about colorism and to challenge it as well.
Okay. So like the gathering more data is going to help you to educate more people. Is like the education, is that kind of what you see as the key to at least starting to tackle this issue?
I think you need to take a multifaceted approach, but I think education is really important, as well as thinking about teacher training and how to help teachers, because their teachers' colorist views will have an impact on student opportunities as well. And you think that in terms of discipline, in terms of expectations, so that also all needs to be challenged. And the other thing is educating parents so that they're not reproducing colorism. So if you have a parent thinking that a child who has dark skin is worth less than other children in the family, or just not worth very much in general, that has an impact then on how that child perceives the world and what they feel able to do. So we need to challenge it in that way. Then beyond the family and beyond education per se, it's also thinking about representation and challenging colorism in representation, challenging colorism in the media, and then in institutions as well, so that colorism isn't reproduced through hiring patterns and things like that.
Yeah, so it sounds like colorism is definitely, we talk a lot about systemic racism, but it sounds like colorism is also very systemic in the systems we currently have in place.
Definitely. And one of the difficult things is we don't have data on that, because we don't collect skin shade data when we do the census or anything else. So you can observe colorism, and people have done research in the US looking at the impact of shade, but because we're not collecting that data here, it's very hard to say that in this particular company, although you might have many people of color, for example, it's very difficult to then say, but you don't have anyone with dark skin if you don't collect data on skin shade.
Yeah, and with that, a lot of times when you fill out a survey, or like you said, fill out a census, there's very, very minimal categories into like what you are. So you could be Black, you could be white. Do you see, as we need to gather more research to tackle colorism, do you see those different options expanding so we can get more research on skin shade? Or is the research going to be more qualitative and talking about experiences of people about colorism?
You're talking about the research I'm doing, or what I think needs to be done?
I guess both. Like, what are you doing? Is it qualitative, quantitative, both? And like, what do you think needs to be done in addition to that? Or do you think what you're doing is like what you need? No,
there's much more research is needed. But in terms of our project, we've got a quantitative element, a survey of 1,000 young people, which we haven't started yet.
Okay.
We've also got interviews and focus groups with students, and then interviews and focus groups with teachers, and interviews with parents as well. So we're trying to explore the issue in a number of different ways. And we are asking students to design a memoji. So do you know what a memoji is? So they can use an iPhone or an iPad, but we're using iPads to design themselves. So it's like a little image of themselves. And so what's interesting there is you get to see their skin shade. And sometimes they look just like the memoji they create. Sometimes they've chosen I've never seen them choose darker skin than theirs, but sometimes they choose quite a lot lighter skin. I think that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, like looking kind of at how they perceive themselves maybe, or like, I don't know, when I make my little memoji on my iPhone, I made sure it was like the prettiest version of me. So like maybe that's like what they're internalizing if they're
Well, exactly. If they think like if they have absorbed these colorist views and they think light skin is more attractive, then they're reluctant then to choose a skin as dark as their own. Even if they would say that their skin is medium dark, they would choose a shade which I would argue is slightly lighter sometimes. Not all the time, but I did notice that quite a few times.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so it sounds like, you're kind of coming from a multidimensional approach in your research that you're currently working on. What else do you think needs to be done in order to gather the data necessary to really start tackling this issue?
I think we need to have some conversations with people who are working on the census and things like that about whether or not this data, and also people of colour more broadly, whether or not this data is something people want to collect. Because I think I've got friends who don't like filling out ethnic categories at all on any form, and they refuse to do that because they don't want to be categorised in that way. So then if you said, oh, and on top of that, we're now going to ask you to choose your skin shade, that might be really off-putting for them. So it's data that's important, but it has to be gathered in a way that's not going to do violence to people who don't want to be objectified in that way. So I think it's challenging. I think more conversations needed, more work needs to be done even before you start gathering the data on how best to do that, what would be acceptable for people, and why we see it as important. Yeah,
no, that's so interesting, because we think about what we need on, I guess, the academic side and the data that we're looking for, but it's a good reminder. It always needs to be in the context of the people that you're looking for the data for, and what they view as the best way to collect it. So
I think that's important. But we need much more research, because this is a very new area of research in the UK. So there's so much more that we need to explore and understand. And I think hopefully more people will be interested in doing projects.
Yeah, because how long have you been working on it? I know you said it's pretty new, in the past decade?
I've been writing about colorism for the last decade. The research I conducted with Dr Nadia Craddock was in 2019. So that's very recent.
Okay. Yeah.
I've been writing about colorism way before that, but the actual research was done then. And then this project started a year ago.
Okay. And do you feel like when you first did your first research, that was kind of the first research you really saw about colorism? Or do you feel like more is being done to get research about it? Or when you did your first research project, was that kind of one of the first big research projects that you were aware of about colorism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
and you're hoping maybe more?
In the UK.
Okay.
Obviously
but
not
the US
internationally.
is more.
Yeah, there's much more in the US, and then work on colorism in the Philippines, colorism in India, and colorism in China. There's work out there, and lots of it is in the US, colorism in Brazil. But in terms of the UK, there's hardly any research done on colorism in the UK.
Yeah, well, and it's a good thing. With it being a global issue, I'm glad that you're getting to kickstart and really dive into it in the UK, because I think it's a very important topic to discuss and to learn about too, because I know it's a newer topic for me to learn about. So I'm glad to be here and getting to see your perspective and your research on it, because I didn't know a lot about it before then. So
yeah, no, I think we're really lucky to be able to do this work. And what I'm struck by is growing up in the UK and hearing these colourist comments at school and the colourist jokes at school, and then talking to young people who are hearing the same things now.
Yeah.
It feels like an intervention is needed to prevent this from happening in 50 years' time.
Yeah, I feel like we always say we want better for our kids, but then to hear they're not getting better than what you were hoping for them to have better than what you went through, it's kind of disheartening, but at least you're taking the right steps to hopefully make that not a problem for their kids.
Exactly, because if it's not spoken about, if it's not challenged, then it will just continue. And people they're not even always aware of it. So you might be, I've spoken to people who are like, oh no, I don't colorism isn't an issue. And then you give examples of what colorism is, and they're like, oh yeah, that happens. Oh yeah, that happens. And so they're rethinking their own experiences because they haven't really identified it as an issue. So it's so commonplace for them. They've absorbed it. They're so used to it, internalized it, what have you, that they don't even recognize it as a problem. It's just what happens.
Yeah, and then it's hard because then when it's internalized, then it's passed down, and that's what we don't want,
Exactly. Yeah, one of our participants in the adult study said that their father, who's black, called them black. It was a young woman, called them black and ugly. And that's their parent. And just think about the impact that has, because our research found that colorism in the family has a real impact on body image and self-esteem. And you can imagine if your parent is telling you something like that, or your siblings are laughing at you because your skin is dark, then it has a really profound impact.
Yeah, well, hopefully recognizing it, is the first step to trying to at least stop it,
And making it a taboo, making it something that people would be embarrassed to be seen as doing.
Yeah, not normalizing it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another myth that we hear a lot is that exclusively dating white people or people with light skin is just a preference. How do you feel about that myth?
I've heard that so many times. Yeah, it's
absolutely.
A really common one. Colorism is so pervasive, and it has an impact on the media, in families, in schools, etc.
Yeah.
It's pervasive in society. It means that when people are making those judgments about what's attractive, it's having an impact on them, even if they're not aware of it. And that's what is really hard to explain to people. If you just say, oh, I only like white people or people with light skin, but that's just me, it's just a preference. Telling that person actually that preference comes from somewhere, that preference is based upon histories, racist histories and colorist histories, is very difficult to do, but it's important that people are aware that actually if you only have a preference for light skin, that's colorist, even if you're not intending to be.
And I know previously you mentioned that colorism is very gendered. There is another myth too about it only affecting women. And I know you mentioned that it affects women more, but how do you feel about the idea that it only affects women?
So yes, I don't think I actually said it affects them more, but it affects them more in the relationship market, definitely. Yes. And that's really important. But it does have an impact on women and men. And again, the US research shown that, so in the criminal justice system, men are affected there very badly in terms of the longer sentences and in terms of things like stop and search. I'd imagine it would have an impact too, although we haven't got the data in the UK, so we need to do more research on that. But also thinking about employment, it will have an impact on men and women there as well. So education, employment, criminal justice, all of those areas affect men. And in our research that we did in the UK, I'm currently doing a big project. I'm a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow researching colorism among young people in secondary schools at the moment. But the research I did before that on adults and colorism in the UK, we found that men talked about being called ugly and all the colorist jokes they were subjected to at school as well. So it definitely had an impact on their lives.
And I know you mentioned your previous research, but it sounds like you're doing research with a different population. I don't know how far you are in that research, but have you found a different finding with a different generation of like kids versus the adults that you were, or are the findings pretty similar? So yeah,
it's a bit early. We're really at the beginning. It'd be lovely to talk to you again about the findings of that research. We're at the beginning. We've just begun our data collection there. But what I can say from the schools we've been to, that colorism is definitely still an issue, and it affects. We need to talk to people of more ethnicities. We're planning to talk to Black students, mixed race students, and Asian students as well, and then other students who are from minoritized ethnic backgrounds. So when we've spoken to more people from different backgrounds, we'll be able to talk more broadly. But the Black students and mixed race students definitely have highlighted the fact that colorism is an issue in their schools.
Yeah, well, and it's great that you're continuing to do research, because it sounds like a big next step in tackling colorism is having the data, and it sounds like that's what you're working on, so that's great. So I know you mentioned that having light skin, the myth is like, oh, that's just a preference, but you mentioned that, no, it's colorism. But can you just expand on that? Like, why would you consider that colorism and not just a preference? Like, if I were to say, oh, like, I really prefer a guy that has green eyes and is like 6'2", that's a preference. But how would you say that skin color becomes colorism in terms of a dating preference?
Okay, that's a really, really good point. It's not an easy one to unpack, but but I'll give it a go. So what I'm saying is that if you did research and you find that there's a real preference, and the data shows a real preference for light skin over dark skin. Yeah. And talking to young people, if I hear this repeated, what I find attractive is a kind of either ethnically ambiguous look, so you can't say exactly where the person's from, but they have light skin, or someone who's mixed race, etc. Why I argue that it's informed by colorism rather than just being an innocent preference for blue jeans or grey jeans is because it's informed by the societal preferences, which are colorist. So the idea in society that white skin and light skin are the ideal and that's what people should look like has an impact then on preferences. What you see as attractive on television that's reinforced by casting choices does have an impact then on what you're attracted to. It's like fashion trends. When people buy a certain pair of jeans, it's not suddenly everyone wakes up one day and they want, I don't know what's in fashion now, but say that previously has been skinny jeans at one point. Yeah. It's not everyone doesn't just wake up and all suddenly want skinny jeans. They're influenced by what they see. So the idea that that's marketed to them, that's sold as something that's really fashionable, something that will make them look good, they then absorb that and then want to buy those jeans. Now, not everyone will want those jeans, but it does have a major impact. And so you could say that maybe not everyone who has a preference for light skin is doing that from a position of colorism, but I think colorism does inform many of those choices because for the very fact that what is seen as attractive at a societal level and what's reinforced through what you read in the books, so what you see in the magazines, what you hear, what you see on television, what your friends are talking about, what's talked about in the music, Pretty Little Lighty or whatever, those kind of things have an impact on people's preferences, and therefore when you say, oh, I just chose that because that's just what I like, it's not just what you like. It's what you're being told to like, and in an insidious way.
Well, with that, you talk a lot about representation and that defining how we view people. How do you feel about The Little Mermaid and the new Little Mermaid and the backlash that was received for the casting of Halle Bailey?
I think it just shows you just how far we have to go. So you've got this beautiful, talented actor in this role who did a good job.
Amazing job.
Yeah, so rather than being excited by that, you've got so many people saying it should have been a white person, how dare you cast her? And so you've got, on the one hand, you've got many children of colour looking up at this actor and thinking, wow, wonderful to see someone who looks more like me.
Yeah.
But then rather than being able to enjoy that, you then hear that the film's, did it do badly? It's not done as well as it was hoped to do anyway.
Yeah.
And there's lots of people saying they're boycotting it and they won't see it because it's got this person of colour in the role. And you have to think, why are you so angry? What does it mean to you for this person to perform this role? It's a fictitious character. This is a mermaid, not a human character. And yet there's such strong ideas around what that character could look like.
Yeah. And so, we had The Little Mermaid, but then we also have movies like Wakanda Forever, where there's a lot of representation of different skin colors. And sometimes people will look at that and say, oh, no, actually, there is representation. We have what we need in the media, and we're good to go. Colorism is not an issue. We have representation. How do you feel about those kind of comments?
Well, I think films like Black Panther and Wakanda Forever and characters like Miss Marvel are really important. It's really important to have those characters and for people to be able to say they're superheroes, people who are doing really exciting things, really positive things that look like them on screen. For children to see that, for adults to see that, that's really positive. But it's not on its own enough. And just looking at the Little Mermaid backlash, it shows you just how much we've got to work through and to challenge in terms of societal attitudes around people of colour. So I think it's important for young people to see themselves reflected. I think that's really important, but so much more work to be done. And so many times that they are excluded still. And that needs to be addressed.
Yes, or I feel like a lot of times they talk about whitewashing in Hollywood where they cast, I think a big example was the Aladdin movie where it's, Aladdin and Jasmine are, supposed to be Arabic and they pick very white, light-skinned people for that. And there was some backlash from people saying, why didn't you pick someone that was more representative of our skin tone? Because they picked someone that was so light-skinned. So I feel like even when we are expanding representation, it's not always super expanded either.
Well, even Halle Bailey, she's not got very dark skin.
Yeah, no, not at all.
And still there's this outcry. Imagine if they picked someone who had much, much darker skin than her, what the response would be.
Yeah.
And if you think of, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I even think, being from the US, I think of Obama because everyone was like, finally a black president. It's that is the most light-skinned black president we could have gotten. And there was still so much backlash over it, and that is still a very light-skinned president,
Exactly, and Obama has one white parent. Imagine if he had two black parents and much, much darker skin, how he would be received. Because the way in which colorism operates, often the darker your skin, the less acceptable you're seen, the less intelligent you're seen as, etc. So he had light skin privilege because he has a white parent, and even then there'll be people who are unhappy that he's in that role. If you think about someone like Meghan Markle, who can sometimes, I've seen her in a film where she's white passing, so she's got very light skin and is seen as very beautiful, and she was meant to be transforming the royal family, and look how things have transpired there. Yeah. So it shows you just how much of an issue we have with racism in this society, because she benefited from her light skin in order to be able to be in that position. I doubt she would have got there had she had skin my shade or darker. However, even in that role, she was subjected to vile racism. Remember the images of her child, her and her child as monkeys and things like that. It shows you that there's a lot of issues that we need to work through in terms of addressing racism and colorism in contemporary society. Yeah,
it's always we might go forward a little bit, but there's still a lot more to go in terms of tackling that for sure.
Definitely. Yes, definitely.
And I know you've mentioned a lot about lighter skin having different types of privileges. We do have a student question that I'm going to take out and play real quick.
Given light skin privilege, can light-skinned people be subjected to racialized prejudice?
Yes, I think that some people get confused because of the idea that colorism exists and people with dark skin are subjected to greater prejudice. They think that if you have light skin, all you get is privilege, and that's definitely not the case. And what you'll find is, particularly if you're looking at a UK example, beyond the major cities, in places where a rural area, if you have a person who's got light skin in a rural area, but that's predominantly white, so in contexts which are predominantly white, a person with light skin can be subjected to really vile racism. Yeah. And in our research, we found that as well, that people talked about growing up in areas where they were one of two, or just the only person, and that the racism that they were subjected to is far worse than anything I've ever experienced myself, as a black person with dark or medium dark skin. Yeah. So I think it's really important to recognise that although if you're looking from a colorism perspective, someone with light skin might have more privileges than someone with dark skin, that doesn't mean that they don't get subjected to racialised prejudice and racism in other contexts. And also it's important to take an intersectional approach when you look at colorism, because things like class, gender, all of these different things have an impact, religion, have an impact on people's experiences as well, and it's important to be attentive to those too.
How do you feel like that intersectionality plays out in the research that you're gathering? Because I know obviously those are important factors, but you can't count for those factors when you're doing research about colorism. Do you feel like there's a way to do that, I guess?
So I won't talk much about the research I'm doing now because we're still very much at the data gathering stage.
Previous.
But the previous research, it was very clear the gender differences. So when we talked about people with dark skin, the men's experiences and the women's were very different. Although, as I said, the men were subjected to colorist bullying at schools, and even in the families, there was colorism within families that affected them. The women had a very different experience because when it came to things like dating, the black men were seen, because of stereotypes around tall, dark and handsome, the black men still had an advantage then because they were seen as attractive and valuable in that context in the way that the women weren't, mostly. Not exclusively, but mostly the women did not feel that they had any advantages in terms of their skin shade when it came to relationships.
Okay, so it sounds like both are experiencing colorism, but maybe some is more severe in certain aspects of their lives than others, depending on their gender? Yeah,
exactly.
Definitely. Gotcha. Yeah, I find it interesting. So I'm from Atlanta originally, and I worked with a lot of different types of doctors, but going back to kind of the light skin privilege and the spectrum, I worked with two doctors, and they were married, and one was light skin and one was dark skin. And it's interesting because I feel like the light skin doctor was treated better by some patients than like her partner that was darker, but she was also treated worse than like the white doctors by like the same patient. And I just found it interesting because it kind of goes back to that, is that there might have been a little bit of a privilege in her light skin in certain aspects, but like she still was very much discriminated against, like for her skin color, even though she had like some privileges compared to her partner that was even darker than her. So I just find it interesting that we talk a lot about like racism in those contexts, but not the colorism of like what we see in everyday and how people interact with those kind of people.
No, I think those are really important observations, and it's great that you were able to pick up on that from your working with those colleagues. And I think one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is also that men with dark skin can be seen as more threatening as well. So I don't know if that had an impact on your colleagues' experiences, but there's dark skinned men have advantages in certain areas, but then definitely in terms of being seen as threatening, that's a key issue that can also have an impact on how they're treated, again, through the criminal justice system, but also in terms of violence and how they're approached.
Yeah, no, it's definitely kind of goes back to stereotypes that people have and then seeing it play out in how they view and treat other people of different skin colors. But yeah, no, I think your research is so important. It's fascinating and something that really, I hope, is going to pave the way in how we approach and tackle colorism. So thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. It's been great. This is a conversation that I think really needed to happen, and I'm so glad that we were able to do it with you. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It was so great.
Thank you very much.